Ladies and gentlemen of the House, this, of course, is a very, very difficult topic and one that I have spent a great deal of time on. I'm not a member of a labor union. My parents were. I don't think this should be about personal anecdotes or personal experiences. We're here as legislators. We have a duty to pass laws that we want to apply to other people. And as Justice Shepard said when he spoke here, we have a duty to make a responsible judgment. As part of that duty, the first thing I'm going to do is summarize very briefly what Representative Torr had to say, because it was important for us to hear his arguments. And I don't think we got to hear them. I'll be brief on it, and he can criticize me if he likes, but I thought he made two major points. One, that individual workers should have a freedom to not only pay dues, but not pay anything to a union if they so chose. It would be harsh on them, in his view, if they had to pay. And he's expressed a concern, and I think it's a legitimate concern, about 250,000 people in this state who are currently unemployed. There was nothing wrong with making either one of those points. I don't agree with his analysis, but I wish that we all could have heard it. Now, let's talk about what we need to do as lawmakers. There are really three things that we do here, I think. One is we talk politics. Second is we actually make the laws. And third, we talk a lot about religion, something that I rarely talk about. So I'm going to go to those things and spend most of the time on the law. Let's talk about the politics of this. Everyone knows that this debate has a lot to do with money in politics. Why are we kidding ourselves about that? And anyone who votes on that basis, anyone who votes in order to cut off the other party's funds, ought to look in the mirror in the morning and ask him or herself whether that worm will ever turn. That is a very bad basis for a vote. In case you think money in politics doesn't matter, all you gotta do is turn on your television and see the ads. Apparently 1 out of 3 businesses allegedly don't look at us. It looks to me like more than 1 out of 3 rich guys decide to buy TV time in Indiana. And suddenly our TV stations have become very important. Suddenly they want to spend millions of dollars telling us how to vote. I'm grateful for the cash. I hope the Channel 6 and 8 and 13 do real well. Maybe they'll give some bonuses out. But let's not kid ourselves that politics is involved in this matter. But so are people. Let's talk about the facts. If we're going to do law, we ought to do some facts. I had a young guy do a little study for me on the states that have right to work and those that do not. Indiana does reasonably well. I'm talking about production workers, and let's get serious here. We're talking about production workers, factory workers, auto workers. We're talking about ordinary people. We're not talking about overall income. Production workers in Indiana do relatively well. There are a few right-to-work states where production workers do better. Generally, those are states that have natural resources. Louisiana, as an example, Oklahoma, North Dakota. And they can pay a lot to people who work in those industries because there's artificially high profits in those industries. But if you look at the states where people work in ordinary factories, the southern states do poorly, and those are the right-to-work states. Those are the states that, for the most part, passed those laws at a time when many of their people were not allowed to vote. That's the history of those laws. Those laws were passed in southern states, my friends, where northern industries were drawn. I remember working for John Edwards, and I'm not ashamed to say that there was a time when I was a big fan of John Edwards. And I liked his arguments, but there was one thing that John said repeatedly that troubled me. He was bothered that the textile industry was leaving the Carolinas. I never told him what I was bothered about. I was bothered that the textile industry had left the Northeast to go to the Carolinas. and then it left the Carolinas. Folks, that's the love train we are on. It is a race to the bottom, a very, very dangerous race in which I would urge us not to be so quick to compete. Now, let's get to the topic of free riding, as it's been called. Look, as Representative Soliday said, contracts are signed between labor and management. Somebody represented the workers in that, and they want to be paid for the service. And somebody represents the workers if they have a grievance. That's their job. And unlike the teachers' union, if you don't represent somebody who didn't pay for their representation, you can be sued, and you will be. I suggest you go to the right-to-work sites and see how anxious they are to help people who haven't paid dues, who feel that the union is unfair. The unions have a duty to represent those people who don't pay dues. And not only dues, don't pay the expenses of representation. They don't pay for arbitration, they don't pay for negotiation, they don't pay for anything. And if the union doesn't represent them properly, it will be sued. That is the law. Let me weave back to the economics for just a moment. You need to understand when you think about this bill that we've had 50 years, nearly, experience under our current legislation. 50 years. In fact, the current administration has been downstairs 7 years talking about economic development and only figured out this year that their failure was caused by a 50-year-old choice in Indiana to require people to pay for union representation. Apparently they were asleep for 7 years. But I'm glad they're interested in the topic, but let's talk about what are the consequences of this 50 years of one system. Well, if you're in the construction business, and everyone in this room knows this, we have two sets of construction companies in Indiana. We have the union and we have the non-union. And in amazing and complex ways, they have figured out how to sort it out. They haven't violated the antitrust laws by directly allocating the work, but in miraculous ways, we kind of know what's going to be a union job and what's not going to be a union job. And of course, if we change the rules and make the unions weaker, that little part of the earth, that little part of the economic fabric of this state will be shaken. And I will suggest to you it'll be shaken in a way that will hurt the union companies. And the owners and managers of those companies will suffer. And contractors from out of this state, principally non-union contractors, will find it easier to come to Indiana and send their profits elsewhere and bring their workers here, despite all the lovely talk here about local preferences. We have built up a local preference through the arrangement between union and non-union. And of course, we have driven up the wages for the non-union workers. Does anybody doubt that? Does anyone think that if there were no construction unions, that the non-union construction workers wouldn't be hurt? I mean, come on. We all know that. The unions have a tendency to push the wages up. I'm not interested in picking winners in economics. I like it that Honda has to pay about the same hourly wage as GM. I think I know why. I don't think it's out of affection. I think it's because they want to get the workers and they know they better compete. I'm worried about the people in the grocery stores. My mother worked in a grocery store for years till arthritis made it impossible for her to run the cash register, okay? I would bet you that if we hurt the union movement, we will reduce the wages in the supermarkets for the non-union workers. Of course, we will probably do it for the union workers, but we'll do it also for the non-union workers. They're not here. They're not guilty of free riding. They're guilty of participating in an economy where wages have been driven up by the union movement. They're not guilty of it. They're lucky to have it. So, what is the problem here? The problem here it's globalization and productivity. That's the problem in America. That's a huge problem, and we're doing exactly nothing about that in this legislature. What we're doing is fighting about this one issue, and I have been critical of the leaders on both sides, as everyone knows. What are we doing about construction work for young people? What are we doing about infrastructure? How am I living in a state where in some districts kids can't get a school bus to school because the school doesn't have the money? And we're talking about how can we depress wages. Now, the issue is personal income. There is enormous pressure on personal income in this country. It's being driven downwards, and to some perverse extent it's being driven upwards. A small group is getting a great deal of money. Is this the time to seize the weapons of the weak? Is this really what we're called upon in an economic crisis? We'll seize the weapons of the weak. That doesn't seem to me to be the right response. Are we sending a signal? I agree with Representative Torr on this point. We are sending a signal, but what is the signal? It is a signal of surrender. It says that in the fight for higher wages, we'll put down one of our weapons. At a time when we're not giving enough money to our universities and schools, in fact, we've cut the money. Those are part of our weapons for economic strength. At a time where we're not doing what we should do for our infrastructure, we've got another weapon. What's intriguing to me is this is a private sector weapon. We're not busy enough in this legislature dealing with our duties. We're changing the economic rules for the private sector. I don't think we should do that after 50 years, especially not to send this sort of signal. Now, I mentioned, and this is, I try to avoid talking about religion here. I even have a hard time getting up when we pray because I don't want to put on the dog about that issue. But there's a guy who is generally recognized by those who know these things named Isaiah who talked about this in chapters 9 and 10, and he talked about a very hard time in the history of Israel. And his phrase was wonderful. He said, "No one spares a thought for his brother." That's what's going on in this country and in this legislation. Everybody wants someone else to blame. Everybody wants someone else to pay for our problem. No one spares a thought for his brother. I started out by saying we're legislators, and that's what we're doing here. We're passing a bill that, as I tried to indicate, I think has enormous problems. It may enrich some lawyers. It doesn't distinguish between unions and non-unions, but what did Isaiah say? He said, "Woe to those who enact unjust decrees. Woe to those who compose oppressive legislation. Woe to those who deny justice to the weak and cheat the humblest of my people of fair judgment." I saw who has stood in this hall. I know they care about their future. We ought to care about their future too, and not seize the weapons of the poor. Thank you.